She was running barefoot down an empty highway in the middle of the night, one handcuff dangling from her wrist, screaming at the headlights of a stranger's truck. She wasn't supposed to be alive. And what she was about to tell the police would crack open one of the darkest, most disturbing cases in American history. A case that had been hiding in plain sight for years, in a quiet neighborhood, behind a friendly smile and the smell of fresh-baked bread. Before we go any further, if you're someone who loves stories that are real, raw, and impossible to look away from, hit that subscribe button right now. It began on a sandbar in Alaska, September 12, 1982. Two off-duty police officers were wrapping up a long day of hunting about 20 miles outside of Anchorage. No roads, no phone signal, no other people for miles. The only way in or out was by small plane or boat. As the lights started to fade, they made their way down to the Knik River and began following the exposed sandbar back toward camp. The ground was easier there, flat and quiet. Then one of them stopped. There was a boot sticking out of the sand. Just sitting there, half buried. It looked like something the river had pushed up. But as they got closer, the sight shifted from strange to horrifying. There was a leg bone still inside that boot. Both men went completely still. They were cops. They understood immediately what they were looking at. And they knew better than to touch anything. So they did the hardest thing possible. They marked the location, turned around, and walked away. The next morning, a crime scene team came out and carefully unearthed the remains. The body was a woman, still dressed, buried just shallow enough that the earth had begun to give her back. The autopsy delivered one devastating detail after another. She had been shot 3 times, but there were no bullet holes in her clothing, none at all, which meant she had been shot without her clothes on. Then someone had dressed her body after she was already dead. Wrapped inside her clothing was a hospital bandage, the kind used around the head. Investigators believed it had been used as a blindfold. Weeks later, dental records confirmed her identity. Her name was Sherry Morrow, 23 years old, an exotic dancer from Anchorage. She had been reported missing 10 months earlier. The last thing she told her friends was that a professional photographer had offered her $300 for a photo shoot. She went to meet him, and she never came back. They had a cause of death, but they had almost no leads, except for one tiny shell casing from a rifle that half of Alaska owned. They had no idea yet just how many women were still out there in those woods. The police held a press conference. They told the public what they had found. A young woman, buried in a remote stretch of Alaskan wilderness, shot multiple times. They released Sherry Morrow's name and asked anyone with information to come forward. Then one of the reporters raised a hand. "Do you think this is connected to the other women found in that same area?" The room got quiet. 2 years before Sherry's body was discovered, 2 other women had been found in that same rough stretch of wilderness. One was so badly decomposed that investigators could not identify her. All they could determine was that she was young, probably late teens or early 20s. The other was identified as Joanne Messina, 24 years old, an exotic dancer from Anchorage. Both cases had gone cold. No suspects, no solid evidence, nothing. At the press conference, the police told reporters they did not believe the deaths were connected. But that was not what they were saying behind closed doors. Privately, a number of officers were deeply troubled. 3 young women, similar backgrounds, similar fates, all found within the same general area of remote Alaska. And beyond that, over the past couple of years, the number of missing persons reports coming out of Anchorage had been quietly climbing. Young women mostly, exotic dancers, prostitutes, women on the margins, whose disappearances drew little public attention and even less media coverage. Some officers were convinced they were dealing with a serial killer. But conviction is not evidence, and without evidence, there was nothing they could say publicly, nothing they could act on. So the cases sat. Sherry Morrow, Joanne Messina, the unnamed woman in the ground, Their files gathered dust, while somewhere out in Anchorage, more women were vanishing. Months passed. No new leads, no tips from the public, no breaks. And then, on a quiet morning in June of 1983, everything changed. A man was driving his truck down an empty highway on the outskirts of Anchorage. It was early. The road was still dark at the edges. He wasn't expecting to see anything. But then his headlights caught movement up ahead. A figure, running toward him, arms raised, screaming. As he slowed down, he could see she was young, maybe 17, maybe younger. No pants, no shoes, and dangling from one of her wrists was a handcuff. He didn't hesitate. He pulled over. She threw herself into the passenger seat without a word, slammed the door, and immediately dropped below the window line, hiding from something out there in the dark. He looked out, saw nothing, but he didn't wait around to find out what she was running from. He drove, and the story this girl was about to tell would change everything. Her name was Cindy Paulson. She was 17 years old. She sat in that motel room. Police officers gathered around her, and she told them what had happened. Her voice was steady, remarkably steady for someone who had just lived through the worst night of her life. The officers would later say it wasn't the details of her story that struck them first. It was her, how composed she was, how precise, how every word she spoke carried the weight of absolute truth. The night before, Cindy had been working the streets of Anchorage. A car pulled up. Inside was a thin man with a beard and glasses. He looked ordinary, harmless even. He made an offer, she accepted and got in. The moment she sat down, he grabbed her wrist and snapped a handcuff onto it. Then he pressed a gun against her and told her to be quiet. He drove her to a house in a quiet, respectable neighborhood. He led her inside and down to the basement. A chain hung from the ceiling. He chained her to it. For hours, he assaulted her. When he finally grew tired, he told her to rest. He was going to take a nap, and when he woke up, they would be leaving for his cabin in the woods. She begged him to let her go. He didn't even flinch. He just told her that if she made any noise, if she tried anything, he would have no choice but to kill her. Then, he walked out of the room. Cindy hung there in that dim basement, half-dressed, arms above her head, listening to the silence, and she made a decision. She was not going to die in this house. When he came back, he unchained her and walked her upstairs. He showed her his living room, covered in hunting trophies, animal heads mounted on walls, photographs of kills. He talked proudly about where he hunted, how long he'd been doing it, what it felt like to track something through the wilderness. And that's when Cindy understood. He wasn't trying to connect with her. He wasn't nervous about what he'd done. He was showing her these things because he didn't plan on her ever telling anyone. She was never going home, unless she found a way out herself. He walked her back to his car and drove to a small airport nearby. He had a plane. He loaded it with rifles and heavy bags, while Cindy sat in the cockpit, watching, thinking, calculating. She knew that once that plane left the ground, it was over. So she waited for her moment, and the second his back was turned, she ran. But was one terrified girl's word going to be enough to stop what was coming next? She ran out of that hangar like her life depended on it, because it did. She tore around the corner, hit the tree line, and pushed herself into the dark forest. Behind her she could hear him, shouting, charging, telling her exactly what he was going to do when he caught her. She didn't look back. She just ran. Through the trees, over the frozen ground, arms pumping, lungs burning, feet tearing up on the rough terrain. She ran until the shouting faded, until the only sound was her own breathing and the distant noise of traffic. She broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the highway. She turned around. He was gone. He had stopped at the edge of the woods. And that was how Cindy Paulson survived. The police believed her. Her story was too detailed, too consistent, too raw to be anything but real. They took her to the hospital. But on the way she insisted they stop at the airport first. She wanted to show them the hangar. She wanted them to see the plane. They went. The plane was still there. The man was not. While the officers were writing down the aircraft details, the airport security guard approached them. He had seen the commotion the night before. Something about the plane's owner had seemed off, so he had written down the man's license plate number just in case. He handed it to the officers. Within hours, they had a name. Robert Hansen, local businessman, owner of a popular bakery in downtown Anchorage, respected in his community, known as a friendly, hard-working family man. The officers drove straight to his house. As they pulled up, Hansen was arriving home at the same time. His car matched Cindy's description exactly, and when he stepped out, so did he. Thin, bearded, glasses. He saw the police and immediately smiled, walked right over. The house was full of hunting trophies, just as Cindy had described. They asked him about the night before. He said he had been with friends. He gave them names and contact information without hesitation. He told them to search the property. He had nothing to hide. So they searched, and they found nothing. His friends confirmed his alibi. Separately, independently, their stories matched. The police went back to Cindy. They pressed her, asked if she was absolutely certain about everything she had told them. She said yes. Then they asked if she would take a lie detector test. She said no. That one word cast a shadow over everything. The officers who had believed her began to doubt. And when Cindy sensed that doubt, she got scared. She left town. And just like that, Robert Hansen walked free. But the wilderness outside Anchorage was about to give up another secret, one that no alibi in the world could explain away. 3 months after Cindy left town, a construction crew was grading a backcountry road not far from where Sherry Morrow had been found. One of their machines hit something in the earth. They stopped, looked closer, and called the police. The remains were female, buried shallow, just like before. And just like before, when investigators combed the surrounding area, they found a single shell casing. Same caliber, same type. A .223 round. The autopsy confirmed she had died from multiple gunshot wounds. Dental records identified her as Paula Goulding, 17 years old, an exotic dancer from Anchorage who had been reported missing 5 months earlier. She was just a teenager. The police sent both shell casings, the one from Sherry Morrow's grave and the one from Paula's, to a ballistics lab. The results came back quickly. Both rounds had been fired from the same rifle. The same weapon had killed both women. Because this was no longer a theory. This was no longer a gut feeling shared between a few officers in hushed conversations. This was fact, confirmed by science. They were hunting a serial killer. And every officer who had ever looked at Robert Hansen's file knew exactly who they suspected. But suspicion is not a conviction. Hansen still had his alibi. The investigators still had no physical evidence tying him to either woman. And Cindy Paulson, their only living witness, was gone. They needed a different approach. So they called in one of the most respected criminal profilers in the country, a man named John Douglas, an FBI agent who had built his career on getting inside the minds of killers. He had helped crack some of the most complex cases in American history. If anyone could point them in the right direction, it was him. Douglas studied the evidence, the grave sites, the victims, the method, the geography. He took his time. When his profile came back, the detectives read it in silence. The killer was likely in his 40s. He blended seamlessly into society, well-liked, successful, probably owned his own business, an obsessive outdoorsman and hunter, confident, organized, capable of appearing completely normal to everyone around him. And then came the final detail. Douglas believed the killer most likely had a significant speech impediment, a stutter perhaps, or a severe lisp, something that had marked him as different his whole life. Something that had fueled a deep, long-burning rage beneath that calm, ordinary surface. Robert Hansen had a stutter. had struggled with it since childhood. Every single line of that profile pointed directly at the man who had smiled at the police, invited them into his home, and offered them coffee while Cindy Paulson's words were still fresh in the air. Now they just needed a judge to agree, and what that judge was about to authorize would blow the case wide open. The search warrant was approved. This time, the FBI wasn't knocking politely and asking to look around. This time, they came with authority, with purpose, and with eyes trained to find exactly what Robert Hansen had worked so hard to hide. They moved through the house carefully and methodically, room by room, corner by corner. And then they found it. A map, a hunting map of the local area, the kind any outdoorsman in Alaska might own. Except this one had been marked up. Across its surface, someone had pressed a pen into 37 different locations and drawn a small, deliberate X on each one. 37 marks. Some of them fell in the exact same region where Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding had been found, where Joanne Messina had been found, where the unidentified woman had been found. The investigators stared at that map and understood exactly what they were looking at. They kept searching. In another part of the house they found a .223 caliber rifle, the same caliber as both shell casings recovered from both grave sites. And tucked away separately, almost out of sight, was a small bag. Inside that bag was jewelry, women's jewelry, pieces collected from different women, different times. One of those pieces was a necklace belonging to Sherry Morrow. He had kept it, like a trophy, like a souvenir from a hunt. As the FBI carried boxes of evidence out to their vehicles, a woman from the neighborhood approached one of the agents. She was visibly anxious, wringing her hands, glancing around like she wasn't sure she should be there at all. She said her husband was friends with Robert Hansen. She said her husband had lied. He had not been with Hansen on the night in question. He had provided a false alibi without fully understanding what he was covering for. And now, seeing the FBI outside her neighbor's house, seeing the boxes being loaded, she could not stay quiet any longer. She told them everything. With that, the alibi collapsed completely. The wall Hansen had built between himself and justice came down in a single conversation on a residential sidewalk. When investigators confronted Hansen with the map, the rifle, the jewelry, and the crumbled alibi, the confident smile finally faded. He sat down, and he said he would confess. But there was a condition. He would only admit to the 4 murders where bodies had already been recovered, the 4 women the police already knew about. The investigators looked at that map with its 37 marks and felt their stomachs drop. Because they knew, they absolutely knew, that 4 was not the real number. Not even close. So they made him an offer. A deal that turned their stomachs to make, but one they felt they had no choice but to offer. And what Hansen said next was something none of them would ever forget. The deal was simple and deeply uncomfortable. Hansen would confess to all murders and provide information about additional victims, who they were, where they were buried, what happened to them. In exchange, prosecutors would not pursue charges beyond the 4 cases already confirmed. It was the kind of agreement that made everyone in that room feel sick. But the families of the missing deserved answers. Those women deserved to be found, to be brought home, to be given a proper burial, with their names spoken out loud. So the deal was signed, and Robert Hansen began to talk. He described his method in a calm, steady voice that made the detectives across the table go rigid. He said he would drive through Anchorage late at night, watching, looking for women who were alone, vulnerable, women whose disappearance, he calculated, would not immediately raise alarms. He would approach them with the same story every time. He was a professional photographer. He thought they were beautiful. He would pay them well for a shoot. It was safe, it was legitimate, it was an opportunity. Many of them had dreams. They wanted more than the life they were living, and this quiet, unassuming man with his gentle offer seemed like a door opening. They said yes. He would arrange to meet them the following day at a public location, usually a fast food restaurant. But he always arrived early. He would park where he could see the entrance and watch, waiting to confirm they had come alone, that no one knew where they were. When he was satisfied, he would pull up and offer them a ride. What they could not see was the handcuff already fastened to the inside of the passenger door. One cuff locked to the door, the other open and waiting. They would get in, he would lean across as if helping with the seatbelt, and in one practice motion he would close that open cuff around their wrist and press a pistol to their head. He told investigators he had done it so many times it required almost no thought. It had become automatic, mechanical, like muscle memory. He would drive them to his house, down to the basement, the chain hanging from the ceiling. After hours of unthinkable cruelty, he would load them into his car and drive to the airport. His plane would be waiting. And unlike Cindy Paulson, none of these women found a moment to run. The plane would lift off over Anchorage, over the frozen rivers, over the vast and indifferent wilderness. And far below, the lights of the city would grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. By the time Hansen landed, there was no one around for miles. No one to hear anything. No one to help. What he did next out there in those woods was something so calculated and so dark that even seasoned investigators struggled to process it. And Hansen described every detail without flinching. Hansen described what happened at the cabin in a tone that never wavered. Once the plane landed and he had the women inside, he would remove their outer clothing and tie a blindfold over their eyes. Then he would walk them to the front door of the cabin and tell them to run. And they would. Of course they would. After everything they had endured, the feeling of open air and ground beneath their feet must have felt like salvation. They would take off into the trees, stumbling, falling, crashing through brush and branches, blindfolded, handcuffed, desperate, believing in that moment that they had a chance. That was exactly what he wanted them to believe. Hansen knew the land surrounding his cabin intimately. He had hunted it for years. He knew where the tree lines thickened, where the ground dropped away, where deep freezing water waited at the edges. There was no real escape. The wilderness itself was a wall. He would give them time, enough time to feel hope. Then he would pick up his hunting rifle and his knife, and he would go after them. He described moving through those woods quietly and deliberately, staying back, watching, letting them exhaust themselves before he closed the distance. At some point, he would use his knife, not to end it, but to wound, to leave a trail. Then he would follow that trail. The investigators sitting across from him were experienced men. They had worked violent crimes for years. But listening to Hansen speak, several of them had to look away. He was not describing something done in rage or panic. There was no heat to it. He spoke the way a man might describe a fishing trip, methodical, patient, satisfied. When each woman could go no further, when the hope finally drained out, and they collapsed or simply stopped, Hansen would approach, and he would shoot them. Afterward he would remove the handcuffs, redress them, and bury them in a shallow grave beneath the Alaskan soil. Then he would fly back to Anchorage, back to his bakery, back to the handshakes and the small talk, and the ordinary rhythms of a respected man's life. When the confession ended, the room was silent for a long moment. One of the investigators quietly asked, "How many?" Hansen was brought out to the wilderness to help locate additional grave sites. He found 8 more. At other locations, remains had already been scattered or consumed by the environment. At others, he claimed he simply could not remember, or would not. The confirmed number of victims climbed to 17. But investigators stared at that map, with its 37 marks, and understood the true number was almost certainly higher. Much higher. And there was one more question burning in that room. What about the women whose names they still did not know? The investigators had a confession. They had evidence. They had a signed deal. What they did not have was closure, because for every name they could confirm, there were others that remained just that, names. Women reported missing by worried friends or family members. Women whose files had sat in a drawer while the world moved on without them. And then there were the ones with no files at all. Women whose disappearance had gone unreported entirely. Women the system had never even registered as missing. Hansen knew who they were, and for most of them, he chose to say nothing. The investigators went back through years of missing persons reports from Anchorage. They cross-referenced names, dates, last known locations. They reached out to families who had been waiting for years without answers. Families who had never stopped hoping that someday someone would call with news. Some of those families finally got that call. Others are still waiting. The confirmed victim count reached 17. 17 women with names, with faces, with people who had loved them. But investigators who stood in those woods and studied that map with its 37 careful marks believed the real number was significantly larger. Every single X, they were convinced, represented a life taken and a grave dug. 37 marks, 17 confirmed, a gap of 20 that may never be explained. And some investigators believed there were other maps that were never found. Robert Hansen was formally sentenced to serve multiple consecutive life terms in an Alaskan prison, with no possibility of parole. The judge looked at him across that courtroom and made certain that he would never again set foot in the world he had terrorized for so long. Hansen showed no visible emotion as the sentence was delivered. He was taken away quietly, the same way he had done everything, without drama, without spectacle. In the years that followed, investigators made periodic attempts to draw more information out of him, more names, more locations, but Hansen had settled into prison life with the same controlled calm he had carried everywhere. He stayed silent when he chose silence. There was one person, though, whose role in this story deserved to be told fully. One person who had seen Hansen clearly from the very beginning, who had told the truth from the very first moment, and who had been doubted when it mattered most. Cindy Paulson. That 17-year-old girl who had run barefoot through the Alaskan wilderness with a handcuff on her wrist had been the one voice that could have ended all of this far sooner. She had walked into a police station, terrified and traumatized, and told them everything, with extraordinary courage and precision, and they had let doubt silence her. When Hansen's conviction became public, investigators acknowledged that Cindy had been telling the truth from the very beginning. Every detail she had given them, the house, the basement, the trophies, the airport, the plane, had been accurate. She had been right all along. And in the final chapter of this story, there is one last detail, one final revelation that reframes everything you have heard, and makes the full weight of it land somewhere deep. Robert Hansen died in prison on August 21, 2014. He was 75 years old. He died quietly, in a hospital bed, surrounded by nothing but the walls of the institution that had held him for over 3 decades. No fanfare, no final statement, no last moment of accountability. He simply stopped breathing, and whatever secrets he was still carrying went with him. For the investigators who had worked the case, for the families who had never gotten answers, that death landed like a door being slammed shut forever. Because every name Hansen had refused to give, every location he had chosen not to share, every X on that map left unexplained, all of it was now permanently buried with him. The wilderness outside Anchorage still holds its secrets. There are women out there whose families have never received a phone call, whose names were never entered into any database, whose stories ended in those frozen woods without a single person knowing where to look. And now, with Hansen gone, there is no one left to ask. 17 confirmed victims, 37 marks on a map. And investigators who spent careers on this case will tell you, quietly, that the truth is almost certainly worse than the numbers suggest. But here is the thing that stays with you long after the facts fade. Cindy Paulson was 17 years old when she climbed into a stranger's car on a cold Anchorage night. She was 17 when she was chained in a basement and told that silence was her only option for survival. She was 17 when she made a split-second decision to jump out of a plane's cockpit and run for her life through the dark. And she was 17 when she sat in a motel room, composed and precise, and told police officers the absolute truth, and was not believed. She had handed them everything: his face, his car, his house, his trophies, his airport, his plane. She had laid out the full picture with the kind of clarity that most adults could not manage under ordinary circumstances, let alone after surviving what she had survived. And the system looked at her and chose doubt. How many lives might have been saved if that doubt had never taken root? That question has no answer. It never will. But it is the question that defines this case more than any piece of evidence or courtroom verdict ever could. Robert Hansen was a baker, a neighbor, a man people waved to from their driveways. He coached youth activities, attended community events, and shook hands with the same officers who would eventually put him behind bars. He was ordinary in every way that the world could see, and completely monstrous in every way that it could not. The lesson this case leaves behind is not just about one man's evil. It is about who we choose to believe, about which voices we decide matter, and which ones we dismiss, about the women society fails to protect because of who they are or how they live. Sherry Morrow deserved better. Paula Goulding deserved better. Joanne Messina deserved better. All 17 of them deserved better. And so did Cindy Paulson. She told the truth when it was the hardest thing in the world to do. Remember her name.